I was at a neighborhood barbecue last weekend and ran into my neighbor, Mark. Mark is the type of person who treats his home's energy efficiency like a competitive sport. He was practically vibrating with excitement, pulling me aside to show me a new dashboard on his phone. He'd spent the last 6 months obsessively optimizing, migrating his media servers to low-wattage clusters and automating his HVAC to the micro degree. I finally cracked the code, he told me, his face lit up with a smug, giddy satisfaction. My usage is down 40%. This month's bill is going to be my victory lap. But then yesterday, I saw him standing by his mailbox, and the transformation was jarring. The excitement was gone, replaced by a look of total glassy-eyed bewilderment. He didn't even say hello, he just handed me his utility statement. His actual electricity usage was a measly $120, a genuine triumph of engineering. But the total at the bottom was a staggering $450. His finger was trembling as he pointed to a single bloated line item. Restoration fee, $305. That instantaneous shift from a man who felt he'd mastered his environment to someone realizing he was being cannibalized by it was chilling. He had done everything right. He saved the energy, reduced the strain, and played by the rules of the modern consumer, and yet he was being forced to pay more than 2.5 times his actual consumption just to subsidize the failure of a centralized system that hasn't been maintained in 30 years. It made me realize that we aren't really paying for power anymore. We're paying an entropy tax, a mandatory subscription to a 20th century ghost that can't stay upright without penalizing the very people who use it. This isn't a service fee, it's a hostage situation where the more efficient you become, the more you are taxed for the system's inability to adapt. Welcome to the era of negative efficiency.
Yeah, that structural reality completely validates that really chilling realization you had.
It's crazy, right?
It is. I mean, the fundamental nature of the utility bill has just completely shifted.
Yeah.
It's no longer a simple transaction where you just pay for the electricity you consume.
Right, like buying an apple at the store.
Exactly. Structurally, the utility system has basically transformed into a debt collection vehicle.
A debt collection vehicle. Wow.
Yeah. The physical mechanics of delivering power have been totally eclipsed by the financial and regulatory mechanics of accumulated liability. So in this deep dive, we're going to deconstruct how this entropy tax actually functions.
Because it's not just bad luck. There's a whole architecture here.
Absolutely. We're looking at the financial architecture, the regulatory frameworks, the physical decay, and how the relentless pursuit of individual efficiency has ironically triggered a systemic crisis.
To really grasp the profound reality of this shift, I think we need to step away from the abstract numbers on Mark's phone. We need to look at the physical, localized impact of this.
All right, get out of the spreadsheets for a second.
Exactly. Let's travel down to Lake Charles, Louisiana, and look at Elias. He's a retired mechanic.
Okay, let's set the scene for Elias.
You have to picture a heavily humid Tuesday afternoon in the deep south. The air is thick, right? It's that oppressive heat that just presses down on everything and makes it hard to breathe.
Yeah, that real stifling humidity.
And Elias is sitting at his kitchen table. It's this worn, peeling laminate surface. But inside his house, it is completely silent.
Because the air conditioning is off.
Deliberately turned off. He is sitting in the sweltering heat, physically wiping sweat from his forehead. He's enduring this intense physical discomfort just to save every possible penny on his fixed retirement income.
Just trying to scrape by.
And there he is, staring down at a paper utility bill.
And that physical piece of paper, it tells a story of a profound disconnect between individual action and systemic cost.
He is literally tracing the numbers on the paper with a grease-stained finger. The restoration fee on his statement is nearly triple the cost of the actual electrons he used to power his modest life.
Triple? Wild.
It's a staggering premium for the supposed restoration of a grid that still leaves his lights flickering every time a summer breeze kicks up off the Gulf.
And the visual contradiction happening right there at that kitchen table is stark. I mean, right outside Elias's window, the utility wires are visible.
Yeah, they're right there.
And they are physically frayed. They sag heavily between the wooden poles, and some of those poles are visibly leaning. The physical infrastructure is decaying in plain sight.
You can literally see it falling apart.
Exactly. Yet his monthly bill carries the crushing financial weight of decades of deferred maintenance.
That feeling of powerlessness is really the defining psychological impact here. I mean, you have to realize that even if Elias sat in total sweltering darkness for an entire month.
If he just drew nothing.
Right. If he flipped off the main breaker and drew absolutely zero power from the grid, that restoration fee would still be there. It would still demand its payment.
He's trapped.
He is forced to subsidize the very decay that threatens his comfort and safety. The utility company is acting not as a service provider, but, like you said, as a debt collector for a ghost system.
Well, to understand how this institutionalized price inversion becomes undeniable, we have to break down the math of this utility metabolism.
Okay.
Let's go back to Mark's $450 bill. There are really three main components. First is the fixed access cost.
The connection fee.
Right, the basic price just to have the physical copper wire attached to the house. In his case, it's $25.
Which is basically a rounding error. That $25 represents merely 5.5% of the total bill. It's a totally negligible fraction of his overall financial burden.
Yeah. Then we have the variable cost. This is the actual energy usage.
The commodity that Mark spent 6 months and thousands of dollars obsessively trying to minimize, right? With his low wattage clusters and everything.
Exactly. And that comes to $120.
Okay, so $120.
And that variable cost, the actual product being purchased, the electricity itself, that represents only 26.7% of the total bill.
Less than 27%, leaving the staggering remainder, the $305 restoration fee.
Yeah.
That single line item makes up 67.8% of the total expenditure. So less than 27% of your money goes toward the actual commodity. Almost 73% is dedicated to the mere existence, repair, and debt servicing of the delivery mechanism itself.
The product has become completely secondary to the pipeline.
That is just, it's a total inversion of how a market is supposed to work.
And this inversion is driven by a very specific regulatory framework known as Cost of Service Regulation, or COSR.
COSR.
Well, under this model, investor-owned utilities do not generate profit simply by selling electricity efficiently. They actually operate as government-sanctioned monopolies.
Right, because you can't really have 5 different companies running 5 different sets of power lines down your street.
Exactly. So in exchange for that monopoly status, regulators allow them to earn a guaranteed rate of return on their capital investments.
Wait, on their capital investment?
Yeah. This massive pool of capital investments like power plants, substations, transmission towers, that's all known as their rate base.
Let me make sure I am fully absorbing this. Under COSR, the utility company doesn't actually make money based on how well they run the grid, or how much electricity they sell,
No.
or how satisfied their customers are. Their profit margin is strictly dictated by how much money they spend building physical infrastructure.
That is the core mechanism, yes. And it creates a really powerful economic distortion known as the Average-Johnson effect.
The Average-Johnson effect.
Yeah, it was first theorized in the 1960s. This effect occurs when the allowed return on equity, which is the guaranteed profit margin set by state regulators, exceeds the actual cost of acquiring capital.
Okay, so when they are guaranteed to make more money than it costs them to borrow money?
Exactly. Yeah. When that happens, utilities have a massive systemic financial incentive to overinvest in huge capital projects.
Because every dollar they spend gets them a guaranteed return.
Right. They are highly motivated to build more generation plants, more high-voltage transmission lines, and more distribution substations, regardless of whether that new infrastructure is strictly necessary for efficiency.
Because every single dollar spent on a new physical asset gets added to the rate base, and that rate base earns a guaranteed, 8%, 9%, or 10% return year after year.
Exactly. But crucially, they're not incentivized to invest in non-capitalized operational efficiencies or just routine maintenance.
Like tree trimming.
Yeah, operations and maintenance expenses, often called O&M, do not earn a return. They are simply passed through to the consumer at cost.
Wow.
So building a new billion-dollar transmission line generates millions in pure profit for shareholders.
But paying local crews to aggressively trim trees around the existing lines.
Or routinely replacing aging transformers before they spark and fail, that doesn't generate that same profit.
Let me try an analogy here to see if the absurdity of this maps onto normal commerce. Let's say I lease a car. I pay for the lease based on the value of the car and the miles I drive, right? Sure. I pay for the usage of the vehicle. I do not get slapped with a $300 surcharge on my monthly statement because the dealership's roof started leaking after 30 years of total neglect.
Right.
Or because the owner decided to build a lavish, unnecessary new showroom across town. The basic rules of commerce dictate that the provider bears the cost of maintaining their own business infrastructure. Why does the fundamental logic of capitalism completely invert the moment we talk about the power grid?
Well, that inversion is codified by something called the regulatory compact.
A regulatory compact?
Yeah. In a normal competitive market, like your car dealership example, if they make a bad investment or fail to maintain their roof, they lose money. The risk is borne entirely by the company and its shareholders. But the regulatory compact fundamentally alters this relationship. It socializes the risk while privatizing the profit.
Socializes the risk, privatizes the profit.
Under this compact, the utility is legally mandated to provide reliable service to everyone in its territory. And in return for taking on that universal service mandate, the state guarantees the utility the opportunity to recover all of its prudently incurred costs from the ratepayers.
Plus a healthy profit on capital.
Plus a healthy profit on capital.
So what happens when a massive Category 4 hurricane hits Louisiana? Or a system fails precisely because it wasn't maintained and half the grid is wiped out?
This is where the paradox of the Everett-Johnson effect reaches its ultimate logical conclusion. If a utility spends $1 billion on post-storm repairs, completely rebuilding infrastructure that was destroyed, that $1 billion is often treated by regulators as a new capital investment.
You've got to be kidding me.
It gets added to the rate base. The utility is legally entitled to earn around a 10% profit on that $1 billion over the next several decades.
So the utility company actually profits from the disaster. They make more money because the storm wiped out their lines, or because the lines were so brittle they collapsed under high winds.
The deterioration of the system becomes a primary source of future revenue. The more the grid breaks, the more capital must be deployed to fix it.
And therefore, the more the utility eventually earns in restoration and capital improvement fees.
Exactly. The financial incentive is perfectly aligned with continuous capital deployment, not with preventative maintenance that would avoid the disaster in the first place.
And it brings us to the clinical, bureaucratic nature of how this disaster debt is actually processed. Let's step into the world of Sarah.
Sure.
Sarah is a legal clerk working in Ohio, and her daily reality involves processing the incredibly dense, microscopic fine print of utility filings and ratepayer-backed bonds.
A lot of paperwork.
Her physical environment is one of absolute clinical coldness. We're talking about windowless rooms, humming fluorescent lighting, and towering stacks of little documents.
Very bureaucratic.
Her entire job is to process documents that seamlessly, mathematically transform human lives and local communities into financial collateral for Wall Street investors.
It's the literal translation of physical infrastructure failure into abstract, tradable financial instruments.
And Sarah actually sees the human cost of this abstraction. She lives next to an elderly neighbor. This neighbor is living on a very tight fixed income, and he became desperate to lower his monthly utility burden. He saw his bills creeping up every single month. He drained thousands of dollars from his life savings. He hired contractors to install high-end, energy-efficient windows. He blew new insulation into his attic, and he replaced every single bulb in his house with LEDs.
He was playing the game exactly as instructed.
Exactly. Following every public service announcement, investing his personal capital to reduce his systemic demand on the grid.
He acted completely rationally under the assumption that a reduction in consumption would yield a proportional financial reward.
But when the next billing cycle arrived, Sarah described the palpable shame in her neighbor's eyes. His bill had stayed totally stagnant. The efficiency he was sold, the promised savings from draining his life savings, it was a complete illusion. The drop in his variable usage was wiped out by a single massive line item, a non-bypassable charge. He realized he wasn't just paying for the electricity he used today, he was paying off a 20-year bond issue to fix a transformer that had exploded before his grandchildren were even born.
This is how the regulatory compact has evolved. The state apparatus guarantees the utilities' profit margins, while the citizens, regardless of their individual behavior or conservation efforts or consumption levels, are forced to bear the financial risk of every storm, every deferred maintenance failure, and every structural collapse.
So how does it actually work mechanically? I mean, how does a blown transformer in Ohio or a catastrophic wildfire in California physically turn into a 20-year bond that shows up on a residential bill?
Well, this introduces the mechanics of utility securitization.
Utility securitization.
Right. When a massive extraordinary cost arises, this could be catastrophic storm damage or the multi-billion-dollar liability from a utility-caused wildfire, or even the staggering cost of retiring an aging, uneconomical nuclear plant. The utility companies do not simply absorb that loss. State regulators step in and allow the utilities to package these massive billions of dollars in costs and literally sell them to the financial markets.
Wait, they sell their own disaster debt. How do you sell a broken transformer to Wall Street?
Okay, so the state legislature passes a law allowing the utility to create a legally separate entity, usually called a special purpose entity, or SPE.
Like a shell company.
Yeah, a shell company. The utility transfers the legal right to collect future fees from you, the ratepayer, directly to this SPE.
Wow.
The SPE then goes to Wall Street and issues bonds to investors. And because these bonds are backed by the legally guaranteed state-mandated future payments of a captive ratepayer base.
Captive being the key word.
Exactly. Rating agencies like Moody's or S&P view them as virtually risk-free. They're often given AAA ratings. And because they are low risk, they secure a very low interest rate.
Right. The utility creates a shell company, transfers the right to tax the citizens to that shell company, and Wall Street buys the bonds, and the utility gets a massive upfront lump sum of cash immediately to cover their disaster costs.
They receive the cash infusion immediately without having to issue new corporate equity, which would dilute their shareholders,
Right.
and without taking on high-interest corporate debt, which would hurt their balance sheet.
That's incredibly convenient for them.
In return, the state legislation guarantees that the Wall Street investors who bought those bonds will be paid back with interest over 10, 20, or even 30 years.
And they guarantee that payback through this non-bypassable charge. Let's rigorously define that term because non-bypassable sounds terrifyingly absolute.
It is absolute by design. A non-bypassable charge is a legally inescapable fee designed specifically to cover these securitized legacy costs. It is enshrined in stringent legal codes at both the federal and state levels.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. It's heavily referenced in the Code of Federal Regulations, specifically 10 CFR 50.2. That dictates the definitions and regulations for funding the decommissioning of nuclear facilities.
So if a nuclear plant shuts down,
The massive multi-billion-dollar cost to dismantle it safely is securitized and passed directly to consumers as a non-bypassable charge.
edible.
And at the state level, you see it in laws like California's Senate Bill 901 and Assembly Bill 10L54, which were enacted specifically to authorize the securitization of billions of dollars in wildfire mitigation and liability costs.
And these charges don't usually say Wall Street bond repayment on the bill, do they? They are hidden under a layer of bureaucratic camouflage.
Absolutely. They are often obscured under incredibly dry nomenclature. On a bill, they might be listed as stranded cost charges, transition charges, competitive transition charges, wire charges, or exit fees.
Here is where the logic of this system feels like it breaks down into something almost dystopian.
No.
The utility, a private, investor-owned, for-profit company, essentially takes out a multi-billion-dollar loan to cover its own operational failures or legacy costs. But the state legally forces you, the consumer, to act as the permanent cosigner on that loan. And the non-bypassable part means that even if you spend $30,000 of your own money to install a massive solar array on your roof and a battery wall in your garage, drastically cutting your physical reliance on the grid, you still cannot bypass this debt.
That is the functional reality of hostage logic.
A hostage logic.
Yeah. From the perspective of technocrats, utility executives, and state regulators, this arrangement is entirely necessary for survival. They argue that without securitization, the utility would face immediate insolvency after a major disaster.
Because they'd be on the hook for billions.
Right. The borrowing costs for the utility would skyrocket to junk bond levels, or they would be forced into Chapter 11 bankruptcy. And regulators fear that would lead to a regional economic collapse and a catastrophic failure of the actual power supply.
So they see it as the lesser of two evils.
Therefore, forcing the ratepayers to act as the permanent, inescapable guarantor is viewed as the only viable mechanism to save the system from immediate collapse.
But structurally, what it does is create a permanent, unavoidable fee for the individual. You are basically taxed for the privilege of being geographically located within the utility's monopoly territory.
Exactly. Securitization was originally designed as a financial tool to lower the financing cost, the interest rates, by offloading the risk entirely onto the public. But in doing so, it locks consumers into decades of mandatory repayment for past structural failures.
Decades.
It ensures that the entropy tax is an inescapable feature of modern life. Consumers are tethered to the financial liabilities of the grid, regardless of their actual physical reliance on the electricity it provides.
That tethering creates profound, devastating economic damage. And that damage becomes incredibly visible when we step inside a cramped apartment in Baltimore to understand the visceral reality of the utility death spiral.
Yeah, the death spiral is where this gets really grim.
Yes.
Yeah.
He is a young father living in this apartment in Baltimore. He is working 2 minimum wage jobs just to keep his head above water. And the sensory reality of his home is defined entirely by this death spiral. The refrigerator in his kitchen is intentionally kept half empty. He's forcing his family to sacrifice food security simply to reduce the cooling load and save a few kilowatt hours.
Wow.
In the winter, the children wear heavy woolen sweaters indoors because the thermostat is kept at the absolute minimum threshold just to prevent the pipes from freezing.
So he has reduced his variable consumption to the extreme, dangerous limits of physical endurance.
Exactly. And yet, he sits at a small, wobbly table with a bright red termination notice resting directly on top of a pile of unpaid medical bills.
Brutal.
Despite cutting his usage to absolute physical minimums, the restoration and base fees remain an immovable mountain on his statement. There is a raw, jagged edge to Marcus's voice when he talks about his situation. He feels trapped in a shrinking room.
Because he knows what's happening outside that room.
He does. He reads the news. He knows that wealthier families out in the sprawling suburbs are installing expensive, subsidized solar panels and dropping their grid usage to near zero. He knows that when they do that, the massive fixed costs of the aging infrastructure, the securitized debt, the pensions, the non-bypassable charges are squeezed entirely onto the shoulders of people like him, people who have absolutely no financial choice but to stay connected to the centralized grid.
To the urban planners, politicians, and policymakers, sustainability metrics and high rates of solar adoption are celebrated as positive data points. They represent environmental progress and a successful transition away from fossil fuels.
But to Marcus, it is the sound of a door locking from the outside. He is paying the entropy tax for his own poverty. He is subsidizing the green transition of the wealthy, left wondering which will break first, the physical power grid or his financial ability to keep a roof over his kids.
What Marcus is experiencing is the brutal downstream effect of a severe economic phenomenon known as a pecuniary externality.
A pecuniary externality. Let's break that economic term down. What exactly makes an externality pecuniary?
Well, in economics, a standard externality occurs when an agent's actions affect another agent directly. Like, imagine a factory polluting a river that a town relies on for water.
Right, a direct physical impact.
A pecuniary externality specifically occurs when an agent's actions cause a change in market prices that negatively affects another agent. It operates entirely through the pricing mechanism of the market itself.
So how does that apply to the power grid and the adoption of solar panels?
Extensive, highly detailed modeling data from the Tennessee Valley Authority, or TVA, illustrates this perfectly. The TVA grid model tracks adoption curves and cost allocation across millions of users.
And what does the data show?
It clearly shows that high-income households are significantly more likely to adopt rooftop photovoltaic or PV systems. They have the disposable income, the home equity, and the credit scores to invest in the steep upfront capital costs of solar arrays.
And when those high-income households adopt solar, their variable energy usage from the centralized grid drops dramatically. They're generating their own electrons.
But here is the critical structural mechanism. The massive fixed costs of the grid do not disappear just because wealthy users are generating their own power.
Right. The debt doesn't care if you have solar panels.
Exactly. The debt service on the securitized Wall Street bonds, the administrative overhead, the legacy maintenance on thousands of miles of wire, the employee pensions, those costs are static. The utility still has to recover that massive legally guaranteed pool of fixed revenue.
Because they are guaranteed that revenue by the regulatory compact and the securitization laws we just talked about.
So, regulators are forced into a mathematical corner. They must take those identical fixed costs and spread them across a smaller, shrinking volume of total electricity sales.
Which means the price per unit has to go up.
Yes. And the remaining customer base that relies entirely on grid electricity is increasingly made up of low and middle income, or LMI, customers. These are people who cannot afford the upfront cost of solar, or they are urban renters like Marcus, who don't even own the roof over their heads and therefore legally cannot install solar panels.
Let's quantify this equity destruction because the hard numbers from the modeling data are just staggering. When analysts look at the data, the shifting of costs increases average residential electricity bills by 10% across these regions.
A 10% structural increase purely driven by the changing consumption behavior of the wealthy.
And the aggregate financial blow is devastating. LMI non-adopters end up paying an additional $7.8 million annually in the modeled scenarios.
That is a huge transfer of wealth.
It breaks down to about $9.86 per individual customer, purely due to the pecuniary externality caused by wealthier solar adopters. It is a direct, hidden transfer of the financial burden from the affluent to the working class.
And this triggers the vicious feedback loop of the utility death spiral. As rates rise by 10% to cover the fixed costs, grid electricity becomes significantly more expensive.
Right.
This higher price makes the financial payback period for installing solar panels even shorter and more attractive, pushing even more middle to high-income customers to adopt solar and defect from grid usage.
So it accelerates.
It accelerates with every rate case. This further shrinks the volumetric revenue pool, which forces regulators to hike the rates even higher in the next cycle, placing an increasingly agonizing residual burden on the poorest residents and urban renters.
The cultural narrative we constantly hear is that adopting solar panels is a moral imperative. It is framed as the ultimate responsible action to save the planet. But the underlying mechanics of the grid dictate a very different mathematical reality. Every time a rich neighborhood goes green and reduces their grid usage, they are actively, mathematically increasing the financial suffering of the working class in the inner city. The data shows it is a zero-sum game regarding infrastructure costs.
Regulators are caught in a fundamental contradiction regarding how costs are recovered. The crisis stems entirely from the historical practice of recovering residual network costs through volumetric retail rates.
Meaning charging consumers a set price per kilowatt hour of electricity used.
Right. This volumetric model made perfect sense in the 20th century when electricity usage was relatively uniform across the population and constantly rising year over year.
Everyone used it. Everyone paid for it.
But in an era of decentralized energy where usage drops drastically for those who can afford their own generation, relying on volumetric rates is structurally broken. The math of the 20th century grid violently collapses onto vulnerable populations because the massive fixed costs remain static while the volumetric sales used to pay for them plummet.
So utility commissions and state regulators are staring directly at this death spiral. They see the TVA modeling data. They see the termination notices piling up. What are they actually attempting to do to stop the spiral from tearing the system apart?
Well, utility commissions are deeply aware of the crisis, and they're struggling to redesign rate structures. One immediate, mathematically obvious approach is shifting away from volumetric charges.
Okay, so charging less per kilowatt hour.
Right. Instead of burying the fixed costs of the grid in the per kilowatt hour price of the energy, they attempt to implement much higher fixed grid access fees. Basically, they want to take that $25 base connection fee on Mark's bill and increase it drastically for everyone, regardless of how much power they use.
Oh wait, if regulators transition to uniform high fixed charges, isn't that incredibly dangerous for people like Marcus?
It's devastating.
If he has cut his energy use to the absolute bone, a massive fixed charge wipes out any benefit of his conservation.
Transitioning to uniform fixed charges is deeply regressive with respect to income. If every single household is legally required to pay a flat $100 or $150 monthly access fee before they even flip a single light switch, it harms low-income, elderly, and fixed-income customers the most.
Because it's a huge chunk of their money.
A $150 flat fee constitutes a massive, debilitating percentage of Marcus's disposable income. Whereas it is virtually unnoticeable to a wealthy household in the suburbs, it solves the utilities revenue problem by crushing the poor.
So they cannot use a uniform fixed charge without causing a massive socioeconomic crisis. Are there other options on the table?
There is the theoretical concept of income neutral or progressive fixed charges, where the fixed fee is directly tied to your household income bracket.
Okay, so a millionaire pays a $200 connection fee, while someone at the poverty line pays $15.
Exactly. However, the extreme difficulty of implementing this politically and technically is a massive barrier. Utilities do not have legal access to citizens' tax returns.
Right, I don't want my utility company looking at my W-2.
Exactly. Attempting to verify the income of millions of customers creates a massive, expensive administrative burden. Furthermore, it faces fierce, organized political opposition from higher-income ratepayers who argue they are being unfairly penalized for their success to subsidize the grid.
If rate redesign is paralyzed by these political and economic realities, what about changing the underlying incentives of the utility companies themselves? Can regulators somehow break the Avert-Johnson effect and force utilities to care about efficiency rather than just building more stuff?
They're attempting this through alternative regulatory mechanisms, most notably performance-based regulation, or PBR.
Performance-based regulation.
The fundamental goal of PBR is to restructure the financial incentives so that utilities profit not just by building more physical capital and expanding their rate base, but by hitting specific, measurable public policy goals.
Goals like continuity of service, reliability, and grid resilience during storms.
Under PBR, regulators might offer a bonus return on equity, like an extra percentage point of profit, if the utility meets strict metrics for reducing the frequency and duration of power outages, or for successfully integrating renewable energy without destabilizing the local grid. Alongside PBR, regulators increasingly use multi-year rate plans, or MRPs. These plans cap the total revenue a utility can collect from ratepayers over a set period, typically 3 to 5 years.
Okay, so a revenue cap.
The intention here is to incentivize operational efficiency. If the utility can figure out how to operate the grid below that revenue cap, they are allowed to keep the remaining savings as pure profit for their shareholders.
But doesn't capping revenue risk creating the exact opposite problem?
So,
if the utility can keep whatever they don't spend as profit, doesn't that heavily incentivize them to cut corners on vital day-to-day maintenance? If they save $10 million by quietly reducing their tree trimming budget or delaying the replacement of rusted transformers, they keep that money.
Yeah.
Which leads right back to the frayed, sagging wires Elias is staring at out his window in Louisiana.
that is the exact catastrophic risk of multi-year rate plans. In attempting to curb the overinvestment caused by the Everts-Johnson effect, MRPs can inadvertently encourage dangerous underinvestment in basic resilience. When a disaster eventually happens, because of that incentivized underinvestment, when the untrimmed tree branch falls on the aging wire and sparks massive fire, the state is forced right back into the securitization cycle, issuing billions in new bonds to fix the resulting catastrophe. It is a pendulum swinging between overcapitalization and critical decay.
We also see states abandoning these nuanced incentive structures entirely and using massive securitized investment plans to force modernization through sheer financial brute force.
Just throwing money at the problem.
We are talking about staggering sums of money authorized by legislatures. Look at PG&E's $5.7 billion wildfire mitigation plan in California, which involves burying thousands of miles of power lines. Or ComEd's $2.6 billion smart grid rider in Illinois, designed to install millions of smart meters. These are massive capital deployments explicitly designed to harden the grid against modern threats.
And here is the fundamental, inescapable limitation of all these mechanisms, from PBR to MRPs to massive investment plans. They all still rely entirely on extracting capital from the ratepayer.
Right.
Securitization, performance trackers, smart grid riders, exceptional project recovery mechanisms.
Yeah.
They are ultimately just different accounting maneuvers, different legal classifications for the exact same hostage logic.
It's essentially an incredibly complex shell game. The burden is just moving from the volumetric rate to the fixed fee to the securitized bond to the rider, but it all comes out of the same checking accounts.
Exactly. The grid's underlying architecture is vast, aging rapidly, and increasingly vulnerable to extreme weather events. It requires immense, continuous amounts of capital simply not to fall apart.
It's a hungry beast.
It demands continuous financial input, regardless of how efficiently individuals behave in their own homes, regardless of how many solar panels are installed in affluent suburbs, and regardless of how cleverly regulators attempt to structure the tariffs. The system's appetite for capital is structural and unyielding.
The transition from the 20th to the 21st century has profoundly transformed the American power grid. We see it in the visibly frayed wires outside Elias's window in Louisiana, proving that the exorbitant fees aren't even fixing the localized decay. We see it in the clinical collateralization of Sarah's neighbor, whose life savings were rendered entirely meaningless by a 20-year bond repayment for a blown transformer.
Such a tragic situation.
And we see it in the shrinking room of Marcus's apartment in Baltimore, where the staggering financial burden of a dying system is being concentrated heavily onto those least able to carry it. They are all symptoms of an infrastructure that has reached its absolute entropy limit.
The overarching reality demonstrated by the data, the billing structures, and the regulatory filings is that society is no longer paying to power the present.
No.
It is being aggressively taxed to subsidize the deferred maintenance, the historical overcapitalization, and the structural failures of the past. The regulatory compact has ensured that financial risk has been entirely socialized onto the public, while profit remains fiercely legally protected for the monopolies.
We spent the last decade believing that technology would save us, that if we just built better solar panels, engineered more efficient lithium-ion batteries, and automated our homes with smart thermostats, we could declare our independence from the grid. But the ultimate realization of the modern energy era is that true off-grid independence is no longer a matter of superior engineering. It is the nearly impossible legal and financial struggle to escape the gravitational pull of a legacy system's accumulated securitized debt.